Mesdames et messieurs, veuillez accueillir, please welcome Dr. Kate Darling.
This is a Canadian robot. Does anyone remember this robot? What is this? The hitchhiking robot, yes. So it would ask people to put it in their cars and take it somewhere. And it made it all the way across Canada and through some parts of Europe, relying purely on the kindness of strangers. And then what happened? What happened to Hitchbot? He got destroyed. He was trying to cross the United States and was vandalized beyond repair. Now, what was interesting to me about the story is that it was a story. Like, there were news headlines about this. And there was this massive outpouring of sympathy and support for Hitchbot. And what's striking is that people were upset about obviously more than just the destruction of someone else's property, right? Like, they were even apologizing directly to Hitchbot. I'm so sorry for what happened. Another thing that happened last year was the release of this video. This is a company called Boston Dynamics. They're still owned by Google currently. And they make this very biologically inspired robots. And so this one is a little bit inspired by a dog. It's named Spot. And what's going to happen in the video is they're going to kick Spot. And then once more, a little bit harder. Bam! So, obviously what they're trying to do is demonstrate the stability of the robot. It's a really cool piece of technology. But when this video came online, a lot of people expressed negative emotions about what was happening. And it actually got to the point where PETA, the animal rights organization, was getting so many phone calls that they had to release a press statement. And they're like, you know what, guys, we're not going to lose any sleep over this because it's not a real dog. But they also said, you know, it makes sense that reasonable people might find the idea of this violence inappropriate. So here's the interesting thing to me about our psychology when it comes to robots. We think that robots are alive. And we don't actually think that robots are alive. I mean, everyone knows, even kids know, that robots are machines, they're programmed to do things, they're not living, breathing creatures. But subconsciously, when we interact with robots, we treat them as though they were alive. And the psychological explanation for this is anthropomorphism. So this is our inherent tendency to project human-like qualities onto non-humans. And we do this in order to make sense of them and relate to them. And so our ability to anthropomorphize is kind of amazing. We'll do this to animals, we'll do this to stuffed animals, we'll project faces onto random objects, and we do it to robots. And so robots aren't anything new. We've had robots for quite some time now, but they've been largely kind of behind the scenes in factories, behind walls. And what's happening right now is that robots are coming into all of these new areas of our world. And a lot of these areas require the robots to interact with humans. And the interesting thing about human-robot interaction is that we tend to anthropomorphize robots even more than other objects. Now, those of us who work in human-robot interaction think that this is because of the interplay of three factors. The first is physicality. We're perfectly able to develop emotional connections to digital objects, like the Portal companion cube from the video game. But we're very physical creatures, and we respond differently to things in our physical space than we do to something on a screen. We'll treat it more like a social actor. And what robots do is they combine physicality with the second factor, which is movement. Robots move, and our brains are biologically hardwired to project intent onto any movement that seems autonomous to us. So we see this even with really, really simple robots like the Roomba vacuum cleaner, which is a really dumb robot. It doesn't know the difference between you and a chair. But just the fact that it's moving around on its own will make people name the Roomba or feel bad for the Roomba when it gets stuck under the couch. A more extreme example is military robots. Julie Carpenter has done some work on this in the US, and there are all these stories of soldiers becoming emotionally attached to the bomb disposal robots that they work with. They'll give them names, they'll award them medals of honor, they'll have funerals for them. And the interesting thing about these robots is that they're not designed to elicit this response at all, right? They're just sticks on wheels. And that brings us to the third factor. We are seeing an increase in robots that are specifically designed to make us feel this way. Social robots are cute, they have faces and eyes, and they mimic all of these movements and sounds and cues that we automatically and subconsciously associate with states of mind. And there's an entire body of research showing how well this works. There was a study that just came out where they found that it makes people really uncomfortable if you ask them to touch a robot's private parts. So what we know from a lot of research in this space is that we respond to the social cues that these machines give us, and we do this even if we know perfectly well that they're not real. So here's why this is awesome. Because if you can create predictable emotional connections to robots, this opens up all sorts of opportunities to engage people. And we're seeing some really, really cool uses already in health and education. So the robots that you saw doing yoga earlier, they also do a lot of work with children, and autistic children in particular, because they're able to bridge communication between adults and children. The Personal Robots group at the Media Lab at MIT does a lot of work also trying to harness preschoolers' natural tendencies to want to engage socially, to teach them language and coding and storytelling. But it's not just for kids. Robots can motivate adults to change their behaviors or reach goals. This is a weight loss coach robot that performed better in tests than traditional methods of logging weight because it has this really social and engaging design. This is a cool robot. This is the Paro Robot Seal. It's used in nursing homes and with dementia patients. And it's very, very cute, so the picture doesn't really do it justice. It'll make these little movements, it'll respond to your touch, and it really gives you the sense of nurturing something, which it turns out is a really important emotion to have when you're in a situation where your life has been reduced to just being taken care of by others. So some of the things that this robot has been able to do is actually increase interaction between people in these homes, and they've even been able to use it as an effective alternative to medication for calming distressed patients, which is kind of awesome. And some people would say it's creepy and it's unethical to give people the sense of nurturing something that isn't alive. And there's something to that, but on the other hand, given the positive effects that some of these technologies are having on the people that are using them, it's a little bit debatable whether it's really unethical to be using them. However, there are some concerns that I think we should all have as we move forward and see more advancement of social robotics. One of those concerns is privacy and data security. So as robots enter all of these new areas, I see some companies thinking very carefully about how to responsibly collect data, and other companies not thinking about it at all. And this is an issue that transcends robotics, obviously. I mean, if you think of the Internet of Things and all of the technologies coming into the intimate areas of our homes. But one thing that's interesting about social robots is that it turns out the design of the robot, like whether it has eyes or not, for example, can impact whether people perceive their privacy to be violated. And so that adds a layer of complexity to privacy policy. Another concern is emotional manipulation. So any engaging technology you could also call a manipulative technology. I mean, it may be great that we can teach people French or get them to walk more. What else can we get them to do? Can we get them to vote? Can we get them to serve someone else's interests? What if someone becomes emotionally attached to a pet robot or a therapeutic robot, And the company that makes the technology decides, oh, OK, we're going to issue a mandatory software upgrade, and it's going to cost thousands of dollars. And they exploit the consumer's willingness to pay for this emotional connection. Is that OK? Is it OK if your child's French teaching robot has a vocabulary that's skewed towards products and services? Is it OK if your sex robot has in-app purchases? I mean, these are questions that consumer protection law is going to be facing. And it's not just companies. Governments might also have an interest in using this technology for surveillance and other purposes. And then a lot of these robots are being developed for vulnerable populations, like for elder care. And there is a question of human replacement. So even though robots are really awesome when used as a supplement to human care, we are struggling with dramatically aging populations all over the world and not enough young people oftentimes to do the care work that's necessary. So it might be that we start replacing that care work with robots, and in those cases we need to be thinking very carefully about what aspects get lost. Same for childcare. Because really, the effect of any technology depends on how we use it. And whether it's a good or a bad thing depends on how we use it, just like fire. And this robot seal, for example, is a terrible replacement for human contact and human care. That's the wrong way to use it. But the right way to use it, and the way that it's intended to be used, is as a replacement for animal therapy. So it's often used in contexts where we can't use real animals because of hygiene or safety or cost reasons. And the reason that robots work is because people will consistently treat certain robots more like animals than devices. So personally, I got into some questions back in 2007 when I bought one of these. This is a Pleo. The Pleo is a really cool toy. It has all these motors and sensors and infrared cameras and microphones in it. And one of the things it has is a tilt sensor. So if you hold the Pleo up by the tail, it'll know it's upside down and it'll start to cry. So I thought this was really cool, and I was showing it off to my friends, and I would be like, ooh, hold it up by the tail, see what it does. And they would do it, and after a while, I realized that this started to bother me, and I would say, okay, that's enough now, put it back down. And then I would pet it to make it stop crying. I was like, this is weird, because I'm not very maternal, and also I know how the robot works, and yet I'm still compelled to pet it. So the next thing I did was a workshop with my friend Hannes Gosselt at a conference called LIFT in Geneva, and we got 5 of these Pleos, and we gave them to groups of people. And we had them name them and play with them and interact with them. And then we asked them to torture and kill them. And this was quite dramatic. They did not want to do this at all. So we had to kind of play mind games with them. And we had to be like, OK, you can save your group's robot if you kill another group's robot. And they couldn't do that either. And finally, we were like, OK, we're going to destroy all of the robots unless someone takes a hatchet to one of them. And someone did, and then there was this half-joking, half-serious moment of silence for the dead robot. So that was super interesting, but it wasn't science, of course. So I was curious, what would happen if this were done in a more controlled setting and kind of looking at some of the factors? And so the next thing I did was an experiment with a Media Lab student named Palash Nandi, and we were working with hex bugs. If you have kids, you might know these. They're little toys. They move around like insects in a very lifelike way. And we had people come in and observe them and smash them with mallets. And we were interested in 2 things. So first, how do people respond to the robot if we introduce it with a name and a story? If we say, this is Frank, and Frank's favorite color is red, and Frank likes to play. And the second thing we were interested in was, how do people's responses to the robots relate to their natural tendencies for empathy? So we did psychological empathy testing with people, and we found that people who scored very low in empathic concern for others, they did not give a shit about Frank. They would just hit Frank or the object or whatever. And people who scored higher in empathic concern, they hesitated much more to hit the robots. And they hesitated particularly more when we had this framing and this name and story. So that's kind of cool, because we essentially came up with a reverse Voight-Kampff test, which, if you've seen Blade Runner, they have, the humans and the robots look exactly the same, and they have this test in order to tell them apart that uses kind of storytelling and empathy measurement. And our mashup of that is that we can tell how empathic you are as a human depending on how you respond to storytelling around robots. So that's kind of cool. It's actually not the most interesting question. The most interesting question in this space is not, can we measure empathy with robots? It's, can we change empathy with robots? So could we encourage children or prisoners or anyone really to become more empathic through interacting with robots? Or on the flip side, is there concern or danger that behaving violently towards robots could affect people's empathy development? There was a study recently in Japan where they were using a mall patrol robot, and they observed that small children left unsupervised would go up and beat up and harass the robot, which is terrible and funny at the same time. But there might be reasons why we want to prevent children from beating up robots that go beyond just respecting other people's property. Because if the robot behaves in a really lifelike way, we don't know if that could influence how the children end up behaving towards living things. So this is a physical robot, but there are some stories with the primitive virtual agents that we have today as well. There was this great article in the New York Times a few years ago that was about an autistic child who had developed a relationship with Siri, the Apple's voice assistant. And his mom said this was great because Siri had taught him conversational patterns. You talk, then you listen. And also because the voice recognition is still so bad, he had learned to articulate his words really well, and so it had improved his communication with people. Now, the problem is that these systems aren't designed with this in mind, right? They're not designed to teach children conversational patterns. And so there could be some negative effects as well. This guy just wrote an article about how Amazon's assistant, Alexa, is turning his child into an asshole because Alexa doesn't require please or thank you or any politeness when you're demanding things. So the better that AI and robots can mimic a real conversation or a real animal, the more we have to worry about that getting muddled in children's subconscious, but not just in children's subconscious, maybe in our own as well. So some people are afraid that the robots are going to rise up and kill us all, but what if the problem is the other way around? What if first we need to worry about what it does to us if we harm the robots? So in other words, if it's your job to kick a dog-like robot every day, could that possibly just a little bit in your subconscious desensitize you to kicking a real dog? We don't know the answer to this. It could also be a healthy outlet for violent behavior. But if it does harm us, then there's a case to be made for restricting what we can or cannot do with robots the same way that we do for animals. So this isn't science fiction. This technology is already here. And I'm excited because as we move forward into this era of human-robot interaction, we're actually learning more about ourselves in the process. And the most interesting questions in this era have nothing to do really with the robots or the technology. The most interesting questions are about human behavior and about our relationship with each other. Thank you.